Hello, and welcome to this panel of TechFT Live. The panel is called Big Data versus Lean Data. Is there such thing as too much data? And what we'll be talking about today is the importance of data, which is obviously well known. We're preaching to the converted when we talk about that and have been for years. But a question that's now gained more relevance and urgency is whether businesses are effectively using that data to its full potential. And increasingly urgent as well as a question of the moment that wasn't the case 4, 5, 6 years ago, is whether more data, and indeed big data, is always better, or is a lean approach more useful to generate actionable insights? We'll be talking about these questions and undoubtedly more with two wonderful guests. I'd like to introduce them briefly. The first is Suja Viswesan. She is the head of data at Warner Media, where she leads the data, product, and analytics strategy across the organization. Suja joined Warner Media just recently, this past summer, I believe. And until then, she was at LinkedIn, where she managed the big data infrastructure. And before that, led teams at Siemens and IBM, among others. Along with Suja, we have Vivek Jetley. He is the executive vice president and head of EXL Analytics, which is one of the largest analytics service providers in the world. Before EXL, Vivek was a partner at Inductis, which was a specialized analytics consulting firm. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. Before we get started and stuck in, I'd like to let the audience know that you can share thoughts and tweets on social media using the hashtag TechFTLive. So please do. We'll be following that, and our team will be tweeting and retweeting. Again, Suja and Vivek, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I want to start perhaps with a question for Vivek about that question of data and data quantity. We've moved on from a place not that long ago when data and was the new gold, and the more data, the better. Right now, however, we've really evolved quite massively with a recent acceleration probably to a place where we're sort of talking much in the way that we talk about infobesity, kind of glut of data potentially, with all sorts of knock-on effects, or at least that's one interpretation of it. You know, Vivek, you work across data and across a lot of different industries, B2B and B2C. Do you think we collect too much data? Have we lost sight of really how to manage this as a good and as a risk?
I think, Renee, that's a great question. And I think, there's always this conflict between what's data, what's insights, and what's noise. And I think most companies that we work with kind of struggle with trying to strike the right balance between them. Now, at an optimal case, in a perfect world, you would want to store all the data that you have, all the exhaust that gets created from your interaction with every consumer. You'd want to have all the unstructured data. You'd want to be able to mine it for insights. You want to basically have access to third-party data and use that as well. But unfortunately, that perfect world doesn't exist. And what happens frequently is that companies get, the search for perfection kind of comes in the way of generating appropriate business outcomes. So our experience has been in working with the Fortune 500 companies that it's probably more useful and definitely something that creates more returns to take the small pieces of data that you have access to, or the portion of data that that you can generate outcomes from, and work with that to generate business outcomes, put that into your kind of process, start generating ROI from it, rather than kind of creating this, the best solution possible and waiting for that best solution. So I think the answer in my mind is, for most companies, leaner data is better than the perfect universal data asset. Now, I'm sure there'll be companies that have gotten to a certain level where they can deal with that massive data. But for the vast majority of companies, leaner data, but more focus on timely business outcomes is a better way forward.
Suja, may I ask you a follow-up question to that, a similar question? you are on the front lines of an enormous business with access to an enormous quantity of data, I would imagine. How do you decide what data is important and what is not?
See, it's a tricky one, right? With storage, once upon a time, when storage costs were really high, people are very mindful. With storage costs going down, it becomes easy to get any data and all the data that is out in the world. So, but then at the same time, the compute cost is raising. So you have to be really mindful of even collecting data, not just collecting data for collecting stakes, then keeping it really secure, making sure that you have the right privacy compliance things in place. All those become a problem. So it is important to figure out, hey, what is the business problem that I need to solve and what data I need to solve it. So that helped to keep it much more focused on what do I need to get in. The second part of it is, as we collect more data, the other problem that becomes a very big problem, I think Vivek was alluding to for, hey, why leaner data is good is in a larger enterprise, you don't even know there is data that is in raw format, in structure format, then there are dashboards, there are insights. How do we find all these things in a large enterprise? Because when organizations were smaller, institutional knowledge worked because I can go ask somebody and they will be giving me the answers. Now with a larger enterprise and larger data, it becomes a problem. So what we do is, do we need this for the business? If so, yes, we should be collecting that. If it is not, then let's not collect it for something might or might not be useful for us. So that is the approach that helps us to keep it as lean as possible. Still, it is a problem. But what helps is having a clear metadata strategy on how we organize the data, how we can reduce the need for institutional knowledge, and then go solve those problems also with technology, is how we can manage this proliferation of data, if you will.
Sure. That makes sense in an ideal world, right? Yes. Or in a truly functional business. I mean, both of you, I think, present in some ways what is a good data strategy. Following up on that question, actually, Suja, with you again about that, what is the challenge, however, to really implementing an understanding about what is the important data for the business? How do you figure that out?
So one of the things from Warner Media that we are heavily investing on is to grow our direct to consumer subscriber relationships, right? Like through a lot of product offering like HBO Max, CNN Plus, and increasing portfolio of games and interactive experience. This pushes user to have much more logged in experiences. So we know who are coming into our site, and that way we can create a very transparent value exchange between the consumer and the business. So this helps us to figure out what is that we need, and then puts the consumer also in control on what they want to share and what is the data that they are looking to share so that they can get proper value from the business. So I think moving in that direction is helping us to figure out, hey, what is it that we need from the consumer? And then that way we can have a clear value exchange between us. So that is one problem. But having said that, yes, we do have a huge challenge in the media business because we are going from a traditional media business to the streaming world. So in this time, we are straddling both, right? But at the same time, we're just starting that work, if you will. There's a long way to go in getting to the place where the consumer and the business are working together on figuring out what we want to do with the data.
That's really interesting, Suja. And I'd like to come back to the question of unique challenges of media companies and of your media company in particular, and that kind of B2C relationship around content, where you probably do have access to a tremendous amount of user data all the time. Vivek, I want to come back to the same question I put to Suja earlier and put it to you in a way, which is, how do you advise on figuring out, two companies on figuring out what criteria they should use, that businesses should use for developing data strategies? Should it be outcomes or their business model or the scale of the company, the the general digital maturity of the business. What should they prioritize in making those choices about data collection and indeed data analysis?
Renee, I think the way we've been talking to companies is emphasizing certain key principles in how they think about their strategy. Number one is that just the amount of data has kind of tripled and quadrupled over the last couple of years. So whatever strategy that they come up with, the data strategy, number one, it has to be scalable. It has to basically account for the fact that they don't even know the amount of data that they're going to be collecting tomorrow. And you need to have the ability of, well, it doesn't break down at that level. It kind of, you can add on to it. Number two, I think, is basically breaking down data silos to the extent that it's possible. Because a number of times what we find, especially with legacy companies, that they tend to have data sitting in disparate systems, sometimes legacy parts of the business, sometimes other data systems. And the attempt has to be to try and, to the extent possible, start creating those linkages so that you're actually using it for the full power of the enterprise. Number three, I think, is, as Suja said, it's cost. It's the balance between the compute cost and the storage cost. And yes, cloud is a cost differentiator, but even with cloud, companies are now realizing that the compute cost starts becoming a massive driver. So how do you kind of balance that out? And number four, I think, is just the thinking on the ROI. It's actually thinking of their data as an asset, as an incredibly powerful asset, and using it in that way to say, let me take a look at what the returns are that this asset can produce for me. And then how do I kind of almost think with that business lens on of saying, what's this data worth to me? Is it producing that kind of a magnitude of return, and how can I scale it? So those four elements, the scalability, the linkages, the cost, and then the returns, are effectively what we kind of talk to customers about in terms of their thinking.
That's very helpful and very structured, actually, as a way to think about how to filter and prioritize and actually allocate, investment, both of the asset itself, which is data, but of course the cost involved in data strategies. There's maybe a fifth element that I want to ask about, and I want to ask Suja about it first, and then come back to you both about it, because I think it's maybe a fiddly question that is perhaps not prioritized. My experience with a media company, having also really created and implemented a data strategy within the Financial Times newsroom, is cultural barriers within the institution, within the newsroom. And I think especially within media companies, as Suja was saying, there's a tremendous often gap between the culture and a data strategy. And one of the things that we've emphasized at the Financial Times is this notion of data democratization. I mean, it's really important to think about internally converting people to a data literacy. That's certainly the approach that we've taken. Suja, can I ask you about that?
Absolutely. So see, that is why you are seeing the change in the media world where there's a data organization. Previously, it was the product, it was very focused on the product. Now it is the technology and the data powering the decision. So bringing it together, like Vivek mentioned, how do you break those silos? Because these media business also have, so two things that I will say. One is that is helping us, different compliance privacy guidelines is from different parts of the world, is also acting as a stick for us to be working together, especially on the legacy business, because you cannot be solving this problem point-wise in every one of those businesses. We need to think of it holistically and solve it once for the business. So that is helping. The second part that is also helping is a lot of value that the data can create for cross businesses, right? In a media company, like you're talking about Financial Times, or like even for Warner Media, what are the synergies that we can bring between Warner Media Games versus HBO Max to the studios? How can we stitch data to bring business value? So the two things that helps us to come out of the shell that this is my data, I'm going to keep it myself, to democratizing it, is one is a stick approach, which is the compliance and the governance and the privacy side of things is making people rethink, hey, how do we want to solve this holistically? And the second part is the business value that people can get out of bringing all the data together. That's from the culture part of the thing. The other part that from tech industry to every vertical is trying to solve is the metadata strategy, where we have all this data. How do you make sense out of it so that we can bring the value? So one is solving through technology, and the other one is solving through culture. In the culture side, you have two things. One is the carrot and stick approach to bring all the teams together.
That's interesting about that sort of carrot and stick approach.
Yeah.
And may I ask a follow-up question, Suja, before I come back to you, Vivek? I'd like to ask that same question about culture and how you situate institutional culture in your strategies. But have you encountered, I know that you've just recently arrived at Warner Media, so you're probably in some ways still sizing up the remit and your own strategy, but have you encountered resistance? When you're trying to sort of break the silos and create synergies, especially between a business that's actually as diverse as Warner Media or in your past roles?
I think it's more of a resistance. It's the concern, right? There are two things. One, the business has to deliver. So it becomes conflicting priorities sometimes where, hey, that is one thing. And the other part is when you centralize, there is definitely a bottleneck, right? Every business has a need. When you centralize all the data, how does my data needs get resolved? So that resistance comes in, where I think for us, the strategy that is working to overcome that is to, hey, look, we need to centralize data, but all the data needs can still be done by individual brands, the analytics part of it. We don't have to be, we can be a custodian of data, but we don't have to solve every data challenge for you. Individual businesses can solve at their own pace so that we can also meet the business needs. So it has to be a hybrid approach to break those silos as opposed to bring everything together. And that is what helping us to get over the hump of the resistance, where it's not resistance, it's more of the fear that, hey, will we slow down the business when we centralize everything, which is natural to feel that way because it can.
It's a legitimate concern, of course, sure. Vivek, in your experience when it comes to culture, how has that figured into your experience, and indeed in the kind of strategies you might suggest?
So I think, first of all, you have to acknowledge that there is a challenge. So culturally, there tends to be a challenge of saying, look, this data is my data. I've got my regulators. I've got my business needs, just like Suja talked about. And therefore, I'm not going to share it because it'll just make things more complex for me. And in our experience, companies have kind of come at it in a couple of different ways. First of all, let's bear in mind the chief data office role, or the chief data officer, is actually a role that got created in some ways to combat this problem, because it's kind of halfway in between enterprise IT and the business. So the proximity to the business, and to borrow the word that Suja used, of being the custodian of the business's data, starts becoming that much more important. So that's number one. The converse of that is, as the business owner, you then start seeing, look, I'm going to get some significant outcomes from sharing this data. I'm going to get something incremental once I put this data in with the CDO. And it's that benefit loop that kind of starts getting created. So in our experience, that benefit, the benefits of having that conversation tends to be, first of all, faster speed to insight, faster speed to action for the business owner, and the ability to actually create enterprise-wide outcomes from the CDO side. And those two kind of benefits tend to outweigh a lot of the concerns.
That's interesting. It's always going to come down to a cost benefit of kind of what you have to lose in terms of your business versus what you can get.
And it starts going back to that fundamental concept of your data is an asset, and you need to monetize that asset. Once you kind of get to the viewpoint of saying, that's how I'm going to view my data or my customers' data, then it starts bringing all of these other elements of exactly the way that you would work with a monetary asset. It starts kind of creating that same level of thinking.
Vivek, to ask a follow-up question about data strategy and creating something that's effective and scalable, as you were describing earlier. when we spoke ahead of the panel about some topics that you think are really core, you mentioned something that I think is absolutely core to any business and as a business challenge, and that's, you know, we're in a moment for literally any business in the world, no matter the size, the scale, the nature of it, that is in the throes of digital transformation, and also in throes of a speed of transformation now that's really accelerated. To what extent can businesses, or how do businesses really keep up, you know, with the speed of change, but also with market changes?
So, Renee, thanks for kind of bringing that up. Our experience has been that, you know, the pandemic was actually a big disruptor, of course, you know, but the disruption that happened as it pertains to the way businesses were using their data or the digital journeys was that it merely accelerated the pace of change that they were going through. So all companies were at some level of progression in their thinking about becoming digital companies. But when the pandemic and the shutdown came, they basically had to become digital overnight. You know, we measure something about the extent of data-driven decisions. The number of data-driven decisions in a large enterprise, a Fortune 500, went up by 2 to 2.5x, just because of the pandemic. Because now, you know, everyone was sitting at home, and you really couldn't have those people-based judgment decisions anymore. Everything had to be data-driven. So what we've seen is that there's been a big acceleration in the pace of change that companies have had to get on, and it's now become almost you know, a survival tactic of saying, look, I have to become digital very quick. I have to get to a point where I've made the transformation in my data and in my culture, and it's going to create, if I'm successful, it's going to create a sustainable business advantage for me. And if I'm not successful, then it's going to create a very big disadvantage that, you know, I may or may not be able to overcome. So it really comes down to effectively telling people that this is, you know, survival of the fittest, and your pace of the transition is what's going to make the difference.
Suja, how do you think about speed and indeed the pressure perhaps to keep up with the speed of transformation? Again, coming back to a media company and a big consumer media company, where, as we all know, if you weren't doing anything else during the pandemic, you were streaming. How do you think about that?
No, I like Vivek pointed out, right? Everybody was going through this journey, and then the pandemic totally accelerated it, accelerated all businesses. Now, every company is a data company. Every company is a technology company.
Sure.
I mean, in my previous world, where I worked at IBM, LinkedIn, all technology company. Now I work for Warner Media, which is a technology company and a media company, right? So all those transformations have accelerated on what we need to do. And previously, we didn't have enough proof points, right? It seemed like a future. Now, for the business, they can see the value, right? Where you can easily show, hey, this is how much people are binge watching. This is how much people are able to watch some shows in TV in their living room rather than going to the theaters. We are able to replicate those scenarios because of the pandemic. So it becomes a much easier conversation because we can see it right there. It is not some futuristic conversation. So that is helping us to transform and accelerate this change in a much better way. But having said that, it is a huge challenge, right? Now you have a massive amount of data. How do you organize? How do you make sense out of it? And so that's why in the market, you see so many data companies crawling, right? Through this pandemic, even though we're talking about economic, hey, what is going to happen to the economy? But you see so many data companies crawling every day, and they are funded, and they are trying to solve these for these huge, large enterprises because there is a need.
Yeah, sure.
Just to add to that, Renee, I mean, in Suja's business, this is very, very apparent, right? There's a shift to direct to consumer. Yes. There was a model that people were experimenting with before the pandemic, and now it's become a dominant portion of everyone's business. We've seen that same shift of direct to consumer across various industries. We've seen it in banking, we've seen it in insurance, in healthcare, you know, with telehealth and the others kind of prompting, even taking providers to, you know, a remote or a virtual kind of a medium. And we've seen, in addition to that, we've seen the shift to cloud become mainstream across every enterprise. So there are certain basic shifts or pivots that companies are making. Data-driven decisions, direct-to-consumer, relying more on cloud for all portions of the enterprise that have just accelerated, and I don't think they're ever going to reverse. So there isn't the genie is never going to go back into the lamp. It's out and it's going to stay out.
Yeah, that actually is an interesting next connection to the question I wanted to ask, or connection to the next question I wanted to ask. That this notion that genie's out of the bottle, that there's something we're contending with now that is new and difficult that we have to contend with. I want to read you both a piece of research from the Pew Foundation that is from 2019, so quite recent, although pre-pandemic, and not to mention that these concerns have now, of course, been accelerated by the pandemic, as you mentioned. Majorities think their personal data is less secure now, that data collection poses more risks than benefits, and believe that it is not possible to go through daily life without being tracked. So, this is an American audience that the Pew is surveyed, the Pew Foundation surveyed. So it may be a different view in different markets, but obviously we're talking about one enormous market. First, perhaps Vivek, and then Suja. In a world of privacy and compliance, and now this really growing concern from actual consumers, how do you gain customer trust to use their data? And do companies have a different duty now, a different duty of care than before, than even just a year ago?
Absolutely. And I think it becomes a differentiation for companies, and it becomes, in certain cases, a competitive advantage. Apple, for one, has kind of made a virtue out of the way that they handle customer data, and they're kind of using that almost as one of the big differentiators between themselves and, say, a Google or a Facebook. But to go back to your question about what does it matter for consumers? I think there's two elements to it. One is transparency. So tell me about how my data is being used, and tell me that when you first interact with me. And the other is control, which is give me the ability to control how you use my data. That's kind of one of the foundation stones for GDPR, which is now, various states in the US are in the midst of adopting it. It is going to create more challenges for the way enterprises have to manage their data. The ability to actually report back to me as a consumer on how my data is being used and give me the control to pull back that access. It's definitely going to create challenges. It's definitely going to create a level of extra metadata that needs to be managed and controlled. But I think all in all, it's a big positive. And you have to establish those two principles upfront in your interaction with the customer to be able to get access from this point forward.
And Suja, this will actually be the last question of our conversation, because we've reached the end of time. How do you, in this direct to consumer business, enormous, how do you think about those questions?
See, the thing is, we have always had this, right? Once upon a time, it was the newspaper person or a milk person who was going door to door delivering some of these ads and everything. Yeah. They knew about the family, right? At that point, there was no consent or anything. Now we are doing it scale, and we are able to give controls to the consumers to say, hey, like what Vivek was mentioning, hey, you have the control over the data. Once upon a time, we didn't even have that control. What people, who comes in, who goes, and what kind of information gets passed. Now we are giving control to the consumer. But as a consumer myself, there are areas, if for example, for all these ride sharing apps, I'm okay with sharing my location because that's how they are going to find me and I'm able to get to my place. So as long as we clearly define the value exchange or what you are getting for giving the data, consumer will be much more open to sharing that data. And from the business side, making it very transparent. You have the control to say what we can know about you and what is do and don'ts. That helps to create that relationship between the consumer and the business in a much more open way, and that helps on both sides to achieve what they want. So I believe that's the transparency part of it, and the control part of it is what gains trust for the consumer to go and work on it. But having said that, yes, because of technology, the collection of data is at a massive scale. So that now we have controls in place to govern that. And I think that is the right thing to do. And all the businesses are like basically working with the controllers and the consumers to give the control to the consumer.
And just to emphasize Suja's last point.
I'm afraid that actually we don't quite have time.
All right, that's fine. That's
you
fair.
guys
But just to say, I completely agree with Suja on that one. Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. That's actually a wonderful way to end. And in fact, actually, I can't imagine that most of the audience wouldn't as well. You have both been extraordinarily clear and very instructive in how you think about it, both from the macro consulting level and the creating a strategy level. So thank you both. Thank you, Suja. Thank you, Vivek. I'd like to remind the audience that all of today's sessions will be available on demand for 90 days on the TechFT website. And please stay tuned. The next session will be with my colleague, John Thornhill, the innovation editor at the Financial Times, and you may have already seen him moderate a few panels. He will be asking whether the line between AI and human intelligence is blurring. Thanks again.